The courtroom had that heavy stillness that only exists in places where life-changing decisions are made. The high wooden panels along the walls seemed to absorb every sound, leaving only the faint echoes of shuffling papers and murmured conversations. Sunlight streamed in through tall windows, cutting across the room in narrow golden beams, dust floating lazily in the light. Reporters clustered near the front, their cameras balanced on tripods' lenses, pointed toward the witness stand like silent predators. Lawyers leaned in toward their clients, whispering last-minute advice. A court clerk adjusted a stack of files, each labeled in crisp black ink, while the judge's bench remained momentarily empty, a silent throne waiting for its occupant. But in the very last row, almost swallowed by the shadows, sat a woman who seemed invisible to everyone else. She was 72 years old. Her dark skin bore the soft creases of time, each line a quiet chapter of a life lived through storms most could not imagine. Her silver hair was pulled back into a tidy bun, not a strand out of place, as if she had prepared herself for something solemn, something sacred. She wore a faded blue church dress, the kind passed down through decades of Sunday services and funerals, pressed carefully the night before. On her feet were worn leather shoes, polished until the scuffs almost disappeared, though not entirely. Her posture was straight but not rigid, her hands folded neatly in her lap. One hand covered the other as though she were holding herself together, keeping something inside from spilling out. To a casual observer, she might have looked like any other elderly woman here to support a family member. But if you look closely, if you dared to meet her eyes, you would see something far deeper. Her eyes were dark and steady, fixed on the front of the room, but not really seeing it. They carried the weight of a truth unspoken for far too long. It was the kind of pain that didn't scream, didn't thrash. It simply sat there, heavy and patient, like an anchor tied to the heart. This was not the gaze of a stranger to hardship. This was the gaze of someone who had been forced to watch injustice unfold and had been powerless to stop it. 14 years of silence had only made that truth heavier, pressing down on her like the very air in the room. No one knew her name. No one asked why she was there. She was just another face in the crowd. But by the end of this day, the entire courtroom and perhaps the entire town would never forget her. 14 years is a long time to wait for answers that never come. It's long enough for seasons to change, for children to grow into adults, for hope to quietly fade into a dull, constant ache. For her, those 14 years began on a rainy Thursday night, the night her only grandson was taken. Elijah was 22, full of life, with a smile that could break through even the heaviest clouds. He was the kind of young man who helped carry groceries for neighbors, without being asked, who still called his grandmother every Sunday after church. That night, he had stopped by her house for dinner. They ate cornbread and chicken stew, and he laughed as he told her about a job interview he just nailed. Before leaving, he kissed her cheek and promised he'd be back the next day to help fix the broken porch light. He never came back. Hours later, 2 police cars pulled up outside Elijah's apartment. Neighbors later said they saw him being handcuffed, led into the back of a squad car. No explanation, no charges announced, just flashing blue lights fading into the darkness. By morning, he was gone. Not released, not transferred. Gone. When she went to the police station, they told her they had no record of an arrest. Reporters shrugged, saying there wasn't enough information to run a story. The few friends who tried to speak up were warned to stay quiet. And slowly, one by one, people stopped asking questions. His mother, her daughter, fell into a deep depression, spending days staring out the window, waiting for a knock on the door that never came. His father drank himself into silence. Family gatherings became smaller, quieter, until they stopped altogether. What was once a close, loving family became scattered pieces of what used to be. And through it all, she sat with the weight of not knowing, a silence so loud it drowned out everything else. 14 years without answers. 14 years without justice. And today she had decided that silence was going to end. For 14 years, she had learned to live with the silence. Not because she had made peace with it, but because there was nothing else she could do. The truth was buried, and she had no shovel big enough to dig it out. Then 2 weeks ago, the phone rang. It was late in the evening, long after the street outside had gone quiet. The sound startled her. She didn't get many calls anymore. When she picked up, the line crackled for a moment before a low voice spoke. "You don't know me, but I know what happened to Elijah." Her heart clenched. She opened her mouth to speak, but the voice cut her off. "You've been asking the wrong people. Check your mailbox tomorrow morning. You'll have your answers. "Don't tell anyone you got this call," and then the line went dead. She barely slept that night, her mind caught between disbelief and a dangerous flicker of hope. By sunrise, she was at the mailbox, her hands trembling as she turned the cold metal handle. Inside was a small, weathered envelope. No return address, no name. Just her own, written in shaky, almost childlike handwriting. Back inside her kitchen, she slid a knife along the edge and it tipped the contents into her palm. A single folded letter. A photograph of Elijah's mugshot, but not one she had ever seen before. And a photocopy of an official police report stamped confidential. Her breath caught when she saw the date the night he was taken. The report wasn't complete. Pages were missing, but the parts that remained were enough to tear open the wound she'd been trying to stitch shut for 14 years. It mentioned names she recognized and names she didn't. It hinted at something far bigger than a wrongful arrest. And it was signed by someone still wearing a badge. From that moment, she knew she couldn't stay silent. Not anymore. And this hearing today would be her stage. The air inside the courtroom was sharp, almost metallic, the kind of air that makes your chest feel tight. Sunlight still spilled in through the tall windows, but here in this place, it felt cold, like it couldn't warm anything it touched. At the center sat Judge Harold Whitmore, a man with a reputation for being efficient, which in this town often meant quick to decide and slow to listen. His face was expressionless, carved into that permanent frown judges wear when they believe they've seen it all before. He tapped a pen against a stack of files, glancing down only long enough to read the names on the docket. To his left, 6 uniformed officers filled an entire bench. Their posture was straight, their arms folded, their eyes fixed forward with the same hard, flat look, the look of men who were here not to explain, but to endure. Each wore the polished badge of the city police department gleaming under the courtroom lights, but none of them wore a trace of empathy. The prosecution table was a fortress of neatly stacked evidence boxes and legal pads. The lead prosecutor, a woman in a charcoal gray suit, leafed through her notes with the cool detachment of someone preparing to win, not to find the truth. The defense side, by contrast, looked smaller, almost fragile. A single attorney, young and tense, shifting in his chair as though the walls themselves were pressing in. The gallery behind them was filled with a mixture of curious locals, a handful of reporters, and off-duty officers who had come not out of civic duty, but out of loyalty to their own. You could feel it in the air. This wasn't a place where stories were heard and weighed. This was a place where a decision had already been made, and everyone else was just playing their part until the gavel fell. And in the last row, her eyes scanning each cold, unblinking face, the grandmother knew exactly what she was walking into. For nearly an hour, the hearing had moved in predictable mechanical rhythm. Questions asked, answers, rehearsed statements read into the record with all the warmth of cold steel. It was the kind of proceeding where people forgot they were talking about human lives. And then she stood up. The wooden bench creaked under her as she rose, her small frame seeming to grow taller with each breath. The room noticed instantly, not because she was loud, but because she wasn't supposed to move. Every head turned to eyes, narrowing in curiosity, annoyance, or both. She didn't flinch. She didn't wait for permission. Her hands were steady at her sides, her chin lifted. When she spoke, her voice was clear and deliberate, each word slicing through the stagnant air like a blade. "I have been silent for 14 years, she began, her gaze sweeping across the courtroom. "But today, I will tell you what they don't want you to hear." The murmurs began immediately, a ripple through the gallery, a shift in the posture of the officers, the faint tightening of the judge's jaw. She kept going. Her tone was not angry, not trembling, but something far more dangerous to those who wanted her quiet, it was certain. And in that certainty, the temperature of the room seemed to change. The scripted order of the day was gone. Something real had just entered the room. Her eyes drifted away from the present, the walls of the courtroom blurring into something else, a kitchen bathed in the soft yellow light of an old hanging lamp. It was a Thursday evening. She remembered the smell of cornbread rising from the oven, the steam from a pot of chicken stew curling into the air. Elijah sat at the small wooden table, his elbows resting on the surface, a grin stretched wide across his face. He was talking about the job interview he'd had that morning, how the manager had shaken his hand twice, how he was 99% sure they were going to hire him. His laughter filled the room, bouncing off the worn walls, the kind of laugh that made you believe good things were still possible. When dinner was over, he stood, rinsed his plate in the sink, and leaned down to kiss her on the cheek. "I'll be back tomorrow," Grandma Heat said. We'll fix that porch light and he'll tell you all about my first day at work. That was the last time she saw him alive. 3 hours later, the phone rang. A voice flat official informed her that Elijah was gone. No reason, no details. Just that word gone. When she asked how they told her it was under investigation, when she asked where they said they couldn't disclose, she remembered gripping the receiver so tightly her knuckles went white, her knees giving way beneath her. The pot of stew was still on the stove when she collapsed into the chair, the yellow light above swaying slightly as though the house itself had been shaken. She never got another call. No apology, no explanation. Just the echo of that word gone ringing in her ears for 14 years. The room was still watching her, some with curiosity, some with impatience, and a few with open contempt. She didn't care. Slowly she reached down beside her chair and lifted a worn leather-bound Bible. The edges were frayed, the once gold lettering on the cover faded to a dull brown. It was the same Bible she had carried to church every Sunday for over 50 years, and the same one she had clutched the night she got the call about Elijah. Her fingers, thin but steady, traced the pages until she stopped in the book of Psalms. From between two brittle, yellowed sheets of scripture, she pulled out a small, creased envelope. It looked ordinary until she held it up, and the light caught the faint water stains that ran along one edge. Some of those stains were from rain, but she knew most were from tears. The envelope had been sealed once long ago, but the flap now hung loose as if it had been opened and closed 100 times. Inside was a single folded letter, the paper soft and fragile from years of being handled. When she unfolded it, the ink had bled in places, the words slightly blurred. But the message was still there, sharp, unshakable. Each sentence seemed to carry the voice of a young man who knew his time was running out. She didn't read it yet. She simply held it in both hands, letting the silence grow heavier with every passing second. For 14 years, this letter had lived in the dark, hidden in the safest place she knew. And now in the middle of this courtroom, it was about to see the light and cut deeper than any blade. She unfolded the letter with deliberate care, the brittle paper whispering in her hands. The room, moments ago, full of the faint rustle of clothing and the creak of benches, had gone absolutely still. Even the judge leaned forward, his pen frozen above the page. She took a breath, steady, measured, and began to read. If you're reading this, something went wrong. The words hung in the air like smoke. Grandma, they brought me here hours ago. They said I fit the description of someone they were looking for, but they won't tell me who. They won't let me call you. They keep asking the same questions over and over, and when I say I don't know, they hit me. Not all at once, just enough to make me understand they can do worse. Her voice didn't waver, but her fingers gripped the paper a little tighter. Across the aisle, one of the officers shifted in his seat, jaw tightening. They want me to say I was at a place I've never been. They showed me pictures, told me if I signed a paper, I could go home. I almost did it, Grandma. I almost signed. But then I thought of you and I couldn't lie. I couldn't put that on my name. A murmur rippled through the gallery, shock from some, disbelief from others, but no one spoke above a whisper. If I don't make it out, I want you to know I didn't do what they say. I'm not perfect, but I'm not a liar. And if they hurt me, I need you to tell everyone. Don't let them bury me twice. When she reached the last line, she paused, the silence swallowing her words whole. I love you, Grandma. No matter what happens next, I love you. She folded the letter again, her hands slow, deliberate, as if closing it would keep the words alive. When she looked up, the air in the room had changed. The cold formality of the hearing was gone, replaced by something raw, human, and dangerous for those who wanted her quiet. She hadn't moved since folding the letter, but the room around her had. 6 uniformed officers sat just a few feet away, the very men whose names had lived like a curse in her house for 14 years. The first one, a heavy-set man with a silver badge catching the light, narrowed his eyes. It wasn't defiance. It was calculation, the look of someone who suddenly realizes the truth might slip out of his control. The second officer, younger with a buzz cut and restless hands, tapped his knee faster and faster, his gaze darting toward the exit like a trapped animal. The third clenched his jaw so tight a muscle twitched in his cheek. He didn't blink. He didn't need to. His stare was already an answer. The fourth officer shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his shoulders rising toward his ears. He looked down as if the floor could swallow him before her words reached him again. The fifth didn't stay seated. Without a word, he stood the wooden bench creaking under his weight, and walked toward the door. No one stopped him. No one even dared to ask why. And the sixth, the one in the far corner arms, folded across his chest, simply looked away. Not because he didn't hear her, but because he couldn't. In that moment, the courtroom wasn't just a place of law. It was a mirror. And for the first time in 14 years, they had to see themselves in it. From her bag, she produced another item, not a letter this time, but a thin manila folder sealed with brittle yellowing tape. The courtroom clerk looked uneasy as she handed it over, as if even touching it carried risk. This, she said, her voice low but clear, is the forensic report they never wanted you to see. She opened it slowly, revealing photocopied pages stamped confidential in thick black ink. The first page was a summary clinical cold. Injuries, multiple contusions along the rib cage, forearms and jawline. Cause of death undetermined. The words sat there heavy, surrounded by sterile medical language. But when she turned to the photographs, the silence in the room deepened. Bruises, dark, uneven, bloomed across skin like storm clouds. A cut above the eyebrow, swollen knuckles, a faint outline on the neck that no one had explained. She tapped the corner of one image. They marked no internal trauma, she said, but my grandson left home that night without a single bruise. You tell me, how do these appear without cause? The judge shifted in his chair. The prosecutor cleared his throat but didn't speak. The air was thick now, not just with tension, but with the scent of something rotting beneath the surface, the truth that had been locked away for over a decade. And for the first time, the sealed report was no longer sealed. The courtroom doors creaked open. Everyone turned, not because they expected someone, but because the timing was too strange to ignore. A man stepped inside, mid-40s, wearing a plain gray suit that looked a size too big. His hair was unkempt, his tie slightly crooked. But his eyes carried the weight of someone who'd been waiting for this moment for years. He didn't sit in the gallery. Instead, he walked straight down the center aisle past rows of whispering onlookers until he stood beside the woman at the witness table. The judge's brows knit together. "And you are, my name is Daniel Ross," the man said, his voice steady. "Former assistant medical examiner for this county." The prosecutor leaned forward. "Former, you were dismissed for failure to cooperate," Ross cut in, the corners of his mouth tightening. "That's what they called it. I called it refusing to falsify a cause of death." A low gasp rippled through the room. Ross reached into his worn leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of files, bound with a red rubber band. "This is my copy of the original report, the one before it was edited. It shows exactly how her grandson died, and it names names." The prosecutor shot up from his seat. "Your Honor, I object," but the judge's hand went up. "Overruled. Let him speak." For the first time that day, the woman allowed herself a small, trembling smile. The truth was no longer hers alone to carry. Ross laid one photograph flat on the table, a grainy still frame from a security camera. "This is the last clear image of her grandson," he said. It was taken inside the holding room at exactly 3:42 p.m. The grainy image showed the young man seated at a metal table, his hands cuffed in front of him. He was looking toward the door as if expecting someone to walk in. Ross then slid another page across the incident log from the precinct. His finger tapped a line highlighted in yellow. 3:42 p.m., security camera offline for maintenance. The timing was perfect, too perfect. The air in the courtroom thickened. Someone in the gallery whispered, "That's the same minute," before their voice trailed off. Ross continued, his voice sharper now. No maintenance was scheduled that day. The cameras went dark for exactly 23 minutes. When the feed came back, he was gone, and within an hour, he was pronounced dead. A murmur turned into a wave of gasps. The woman's hands clenched on the table. Even the judge leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Ross's final words cut through the room like a blade. "Ask yourself what happened in those 23 minutes, and why did they make sure no one could see it?" By the time the hearing adjourned, the world outside the courthouse had already changed. On Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, the name Elijah was everywhere. #Justice for Elijah climbed to the top of trending lists within hours. The clip of the elderly woman standing, her voice trembling, yet unbroken, had been shared over 4.2 million times by nightfall. In living rooms across America, strangers who had never met Elijah sat in silence watching her words. The raw truth in her voice cut through political divides. It wasn't about left or right anymore. It was about right and wrong. Celebrities began tweeting support. Civil rights lawyers offered pro bono help. Former officers, some retired, some still serving quietly, messaged journalists hinting at what they knew. On the courthouse steps, a growing crowd gathered. Homemade signs rose into the air. 23 minutes of darkness. We see you no more, silent graves. The woman stepping out into the cool evening air saw the sea of faces, young and old, black, white, Latino, Asian, united in anger and in hope. For the first time in 14 years, she felt something she thought she'd lost forever. She felt like Elijah might finally come home, not in body, but in truth. The press conference wasn't scheduled, it happened because it had to. Senator Marcus Ellison, one of the most respected black lawmakers in the country, stepped up to the microphones on the Capitol steps. He wasn't reading from prepared notes. He didn't need to. This is no longer about one family. He began, his deep voice echoing against the marble columns. This is a test for the justice system of the United States of America. The crowd of reporters leaned forward, cameras clicking furiously. If the truth about Elijah can be buried for 14 years, if a grieving grandmother has to risk everything just to be heard, then none of us are safe. Not you, not me, not anyone. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. I stand with her, and I promise you this, until every person responsible is held accountable, we will not stop. Justice will not be delayed. Justice will not be denied. The moment was carried alive on every major network. For millions watching at home, it wasn't just politics anymore, it was personal. By the next morning, the shift was undeniable. The Oversight Committee announced an emergency session to reopen Elijah's case. The announcement hit like a lightning bolt. This wasn't just symbolic. It meant subpoenas, sworn testimony, and evidence that could no longer be hidden in dusty files. News helicopters circled above the police headquarters as Chief Raymond Holt stepped out to address reporters. His uniform was crisp, but the deep lines in his face betrayed the strain. I will cooperate fully, he said, each word measured. But to seasoned political watchers, the tightness in his jaw said something else entirely. He knew what was coming. In living rooms across America, people leaned closer to their TV screens. Commentators called it the biggest test for law enforcement accountability in decades. Every news channel replayed the clip of Elijah's grandmother, her trembling hands holding that letter, her voice steady as stone. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had doubled overnight. Chants of justice for Elijah rolled like thunder. Every time a government official's car pulled up, the volume surged. For the first time in 14 years, the system wasn't just looking down at her family, it was being forced to look back. The pushback came fast, and it came hard. 3 nights after the hearing, a black SUV with tinted windows slowed down in front of her small house. It didn't stop. It didn't need to. The message was clear. The next morning, an unmarked envelope lay on her porch. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 6 words typed in bold: "Stop talking or you'll regret it." Her hands trembled as she read it, but her resolve didn't. She'd been quiet for 14 years. She wasn't about to go silent now. By noon, she was sitting under the bright lights of a television studio, a microphone clipped to her faded blue dress. Cameras rolled as she spoke directly into the lens. They want me to be afraid, she said, her voice steady. But I've lived with fear since the day Elijah died. I'm done being afraid. If I disappear tomorrow, at least the truth will already be out there. Millions watched. The threats hadn't silenced her, they had only made her louder. It began as a small gathering on the courthouse steps, maybe 24 people holding handmade signs. But by the time the march began, the crowd had swelled into the thousands. Drums pounded, voices rose. The chant was simple, but it rolled through the streets like a heartbeat. Justice for Elijah, justice for Elijah. At the very front, she walked slowly but steadily, her faded blue dress fluttering in the autumn wind. In one hand, she clutched the worn letter, Elijah's letter, the paper now creased and soft from being held so many times. Reporters jostled to get the shot, the grandmother leading the march, her face lined with years of grief and determination. People along the sidewalks joined in, some crying openly as they saw her pass. One teenage boy standing with his mother shouted, "We're with you." She turned, met his eyes, and gave the smallest, warmest nod, the kind that carries more weight than a speech. Overhead, a news helicopter captured the image that would go viral before nightfall. Thousands of people following one elderly woman who refused to let her grandson's name be forgotten. The gavel struck twice, echoing through the marble-paneled courtroom. This court will now reopen the case of the state versus Elijah Johnson. The judge announced, his voice steady but weighted. The words hung in the air, heavy with 14 years of unanswered questions. She sat in the front row, hands folded neatly in her lap. Gone was the image of a grieving grandmother hidden in the shadows. Today she wore the quiet authority of someone who had fought the system and refused to bow. The prosecution table shuffled papers nervously. The defense attorney leaned in, whispering to his client, one of the officers accused. In the gallery, reporters typed frantically, knowing this was history in the making. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply stared at the seal of the court above the judge's head, her posture unshakable. Every camera in the room knew what they were capturing, not just a woman but a symbol, the embodiment of a fight for justice that had refused to die. For the first time, it felt like the system wasn't just letting her speak, it was listening. The courtroom fell silent as the jury filed back in, their faces unreadable. The foreperson stood, a folded verdict slip in hand. The judge nodded. "Please read the verdict." Her heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear the first words. But then they came sharp and clear. "We find that Elijah Johnson was wrongfully arrested, coerced into a false confession, and subjected to actions resulting in his death by unlawful force." Gasps filled the room. Someone in the back whispered, "Oh my God." Cameras clicked like frantic typewriters, capturing every tear on her face. She closed her eyes, letting the words sink in. 14 years of being told to move on. 14 years of whispered accusations and sideways glances. 14 years of Elijah's name being dragged through the mud. Now it was clean again. She opened her eyes, and for the first time in over a decade, she allowed herself a small, trembling smile. It wasn't justice in full. Elijah was still gone, but the truth had finally been spoken in the one place they thought they could bury it forever. Outside the courthouse, the air was thick with the hum of reporters, camera crews, and supporters holding signs. She stood at the podium, the sun casting a warm glow on her weathered face. Her voice, though soft, cut through the noise. "I'm not going to be here much longer," she said, pausing as the crowd fell silent. "But I want my grandson to know his grandmother never gave up on him." The words trembled at the edges, but they didn't break. She looked straight into the camera, into the eyes of anyone who had ever lost someone to injustice, and held that gaze. "I fought for you, Elijah," she whispered, more to him than to the crowd. "And I will keep fighting until my very last breath for every other Elijah out there." For a moment, no one moved. Even the reporters lowered their microphones. Then slowly applause began, hesitant at first, then swelling into a wave that rolled across the courthouse steps. In that instant, she was no longer just a grandmother. Speaking about her own pain, she had become a voice for countless others, echoing into a future she might never see. Years later, the letter once hidden between the fragile pages of an old Bible rested behind glass at the National Civil Rights Museum. Tourists leaned in to read the faded ink, tracing each trembling word as if touching history itself. Her fight had been written into state history books, taught in classrooms alongside the great struggles for justice. Teachers would tell their students, This is proof that one voice, no matter how small, can shake the walls of power." Documentaries were made, streets were renamed, and every August, on the anniversary of Elijah's exoneration, people would gather on the courthouse steps holding candles, reading his name aloud. She was gone by then, laid to rest beside her grandson. But her promise lived on, not just in memorials, but in laws passed to prevent another Elijah from being silenced. The letter had started as a desperate cry for help. Now it was a beacon, a reminder that truth once spoken can echo for generations. In life, silence can be comfortable, but it is never harmless. This grandmother's fight reminds us that the truth only lives when someone is brave enough to speak it, even when the world tells them to stay quiet. Justice is not a gift, it's a battle. And sometimes the only thing that keeps hope alive is the decision to keep standing no matter how many years pass. Your voice matters. Your courage matters. And even one letter written with love and pain can change the future for generations. If this story moved you, don't let it stop here. Hit subscribe to join a community that believes in truth, justice, and the courage to fight for what's right. Every voice matters, and together we're louder.